So before we start painting our mandala, I want to show you a few of the watercolor techniques just so that you can get familiar and you know what you're doing. So I'm going to show you the two basic techniques, which is wet on wet and wet on dry. So wet on wet is when you are painting with your brush on a wet surface. Wet on dry would mean that you're painting with your brush on a dry surface. So I'm going to show you wet on wet, but first I want to show you also what colors to use. So you are going to find in your PDF, you're going to find the color wheel and which colors complement each other. So you kind of want to put down your palette just like in the sheet. So I'm going to start with a little bit of yellow, and this, you just need that much actually, because we're going to water these down. Then you have also a variety of colors that you can use, and you can also use them, but I'm going to start with the color wheel and then I'll proceed to add more of the different colors that I want to add. Alright, so now that you have your palette ready, let's start by doing this technique. So we want to start by watering down all of our watercolors. You can just add a bunch of water to them. So let's start by doing the wet on wet, and you can get another piece of paper with this. Not the one with your mandala. You can get a different one so that you can just practice here. So let's try with the wet on wet. So wet on wet, we get a bunch of water and we start wetting down the paper. And I'm going to use the other brush here to show you. So I'm going to get this orange right here, and I'm just going to dip it down. I'm going to get some of this yellow and dip it down. Got a little bit of this red. So you see the effect that it gives you? It's very different from wet on dry. So since it's wet, the way the paper is wet, it can leak out and it can taint the whole part, the only part that you put water in it. So let's try with this purple right here. More of this orange. Let's try a little bit more of that yellow right here. And as long as it's wet, you can keep on adding more of this, more pigment to it. You can put little bit dots here and there. So the clearer you want the paper, the more water you're going to put on your brush. If you want the paper to be more dark, then you add more pigment to it, like how I'm doing here. And then it will show up in your paper. You can even get more water and drop it in here. You can even pull some of this up and just practice and see what comes up in different ways. Now the wet on dry technique is there is no water on the paper. We're just getting some of the pigment So let me show you here. So I'm getting some of the pigment and I am painting on it. So if you can see, it has really sharp lines and there's only pigment on that line. And then I can make just different types of shapes and movements. Now the cool thing about this is that if you put a lot of water in your brush, let's say I dip it here, I can even come and bring some of this pigment and dip it in here as if it was a wet on dry technique. But it's only going to go to that line that I already made. So do you see the difference? And this is what we're going to practice when we do the mandala. So go ahead and take some time to practice before you do your mandala. This will give you a feeling of how it works, what colors you want to combine. So what I want is only to combine colors that match. Usually are colors that are next to each other and that work really well. Just keep in mind that you don't want to combine opposite colors because these will put your paint brown, and unless you want that color, you don't want it to look that muddy. So practice a few more brush strokes and get a feeling on this, and then once it's dry you will see how it looks, and then we can proceed to paint the mandala.